be recording this, which we are starting now. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Talking about a very important topic, probably not spoken about a lot, but the topic is doing the best we can for our horses, both during their lives, so how we manage them and look after them, but also when it comes to making end-of-life decisions. So looking at where we get our information from, what sources we can trust, and so on. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chantil Sinclair, and she is going to talk to us about the first bit, so looking after our horses. How do we decide what's best in terms of managing them and husbandry and so on? So Chantil is an epidemiologist and final year PhD student at the Royal Vet College. She's got a background in human public health. She's also a self-confessed happy hacker. Yay, happy hackers. So she has an interest both in animal welfare and human behavior, which is brilliant. And her PhD topic focuses on identifying factors which influence how both owners and equine professionals look after horses under their care. So we can understand how we can aid best practice and improve horse welfare overall. So she'll be presenting some provisional findings based on interviews conducted with horse owners about their husbandry practices, their relationship with equine professionals, and also where they go for advice on horse care. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will hand over to Chantil.
I will attempt to share my screen.
Fingers crossed. Yep, perfect.
Well, let me just listen to what they're saying.
Sorry guys, if we could just ask everyone to mute their microphones while the presentations are going on, just so we don't hear anything in the background. Okay, Chantil.
Okay, well, hopefully my presentation will catch up. But as Dee said, my PhD is about essentially looking at what people do in terms of horse care and what perhaps influences their decisions. And as part of that, I was using laminitis as an example because, as we know, there's a number of things that people can do in terms of reducing the risk of laminitis. I really want my screen to start working. Can anyone see anything, or is it just black?
So we can see your presentation, but in the sort of not the presenter mode. So maybe if you stop sharing your screen and start again, and that sometimes helps things.
Yeah, I think we might be. Okay, yes.
There we go.
Brilliant. So, just talking a little bit about laminitis. I'm sure most of you already know all this anyway, but so it's a debilitating foot disease and it affects all equids, so horses, ponies and donkeys, and requires prolonged treatment and can ultimately result in euthanasia. Now, the commonest form of laminitis is called endocrinopathic laminitis, and it's known as pasture-associated. And this is associated with endocrine diseases, so EMS and Cushing's, and is usually linked to horses that are overweight. So the reported prevalence, there's been a number of studies that have looked at the prevalence of laminitis, and a study that kind of collated all these together found that it ranged from 1.5% up to, I think it's 34%, but it's hidden on my screen. And a second study showed that of the horses they studied, 30% of their laminatic horses ended up being euthanized due to associated reasons. So if we take this 1.5% prevalence and extrapolate that to what we know about the UK equine population, we can estimate that around 14,000 horses are affected each year in Great Britain, with around 4,000 being euthanized. So it's a real big problem. So as I mentioned, there's a number of ways that we know about preventing laminitis, and a lot of these are around weight management practices, so feeding a suitable diet, regular exercise, And then there's measures to ensure that they get the appropriate diet with restricted grazing and using grazing muzzle, etc. There's things about reducing the amount of sugars in foods, and then other things such as practicing routine foot care and avoiding work on hard surfaces, which is more associated with concussion laminitis. So as part of my PhD at the beginning, I did an online questionnaire with horse owners, and I asked them which of these measures they were practicing. So I find this quite interesting, coming from a sort of, I suppose, novice horse owner point of view, and I've never owned a horse. So I found it quite surprising that only about 75% of people said that they were doing things like routine foot care and feeding a balanced diet, because these were things that I thought would be quite easy to do. But I also then asked people about whether or not they felt these things were feasible to do. And actually, those people who aren't practicing it have come back to say that actually it's not really feasible to do. So we really need to understand why this is the case. And this is where my PhD comes in. It's very easy as scientists that we take something like this and we say, oh, well, you know, it's all about communication and we need to tell horse owners to do these things and they'll do it. But obviously there's more to it than that. So there are a number of behavioural theory models that people have used in scientific research, and I just wanted to talk about this one briefly with you. So it's called the social cognitive learning theory, but essentially it splits things up into 3 sections. So we have this cognitive factors, or personal factors, and this tells you about, you know, the level of knowledge, what people's attitudes are towards the things that are being recommended to them and their expectations. There's also behavioural factors, so it's whether people have the skills to implement what we're asking, and self-efficacy, so do they believe that they have the skills to be able to do it. And there's also a whole host of environmental factors, so what are the social norms in your environment? Do you have the ability to change your own environment to implement these recommendations? Ultimately, it is not just about communication. And I think as scientists, we often forget that. So as part of my PhD, I took people who had completed my online questionnaire and I recruited them for interview. And I grouped people into clusters, and this was based on the type of livery they had their horses on, their main activity, and the highest competition level that they'd competed at. And I conducted interviews with these owners face-to-face over the past 18 months or so, and discussed general husbandry, their experiences and knowledge of laminitis, their support network, so that was both professional and more community-based networks, and then their views on scientific research and the implementation of it. And then carried out a process called thematic analysis on their transcripts. So I interviewed 16 horse owners overall, and these were split into 4 clusters. So cluster 1 and 2 are my affectionately called happy hackers, and these were people who either said they just hacked out their horses or had companion horses, whether they were retired or young stock, or yeah, a multitude of reasons. Cluster 1 kept the horses on private or did DIY livery. Cluster 2 had assisted up to full livery. And then clusters 3 and 4 had the same sort of split of livery, but were much more competition focused and tended to compete with their horses at various levels. So today I'm just going to present the findings from clusters 1 and 2, so my happy hackers. And as you can see, it's very much as I described. They mostly did hacking out, and they didn't compete. It's worth just noting that one of them had competed at a national and international level, but currently wasn't competing, which is why they're in that first cluster. So there were a number of themes that have come out of the interview, and I just wanted to discuss some of them with you today. So we're going to talk about bubbles of influence, yard restrictions, information accessibility, and wanting the best for our horses. So bubbles of influence is all about where people go to for advice, who they listen to, who influences what they do with their horses. And you have what's known as in-groups, so these are the people who you would listen to that sort of fit in your social circles, and then out-groups, people who perhaps don't fit into those circles. So I'm not going to read these quotes, I'll let you read them yourself while I waffle on in the background. So the first thing is that people had a hierarchy of advice. People described where they would go to. They would often go to a vet or another professional if it was perhaps what they perceived as a serious medical issue. If it was less serious, they might go to a friend, either someone who'd been involved in horses for a long time, or who had some sort of connection with a profession in the equine industry. So the quote in purple here is about someone who had a friend who worked at a vet's, but had also been a yard owner, so had been involved in horses for a long time. All horse owners said that they used social media and Facebook groups, but a lot of them, when it came to advice and getting people's opinions, and that was more what they used social media for, was getting people's opinions and to hear about people's experiences. They had trusted specialist social media groups they would go to, whether that was more of a sort of natural horsemanship type group, or particular ways of thinking that there's certain groups around laminitis groups and Cushing's and that sort of thing. So people tended to go to those particular groups. And these are people who have very similar mindsets to your own. And there's a phenomenon in social media called filter bubbles. I find this quite interesting. So it's the concept that we tend to connect with and follow pages who have different, we have the same views of our own. And then we tend to unfollow or defriend people who perhaps have different opinions to us that we might consider as damaging, so we stop following them. And what's interesting about this is then search engines such as Google take these social networks of ours and then use them to help filter the results you see. So if you follow barefoot groups, for example, and I'm only picking on the barefoot people because two of the quotes here were from people who are very into natural horsemanship and barefoot. But if you're in those circles and you want to find out about, a bit more about shoeing, perhaps you're trying to see what the benefits are to barefoot or not, you're more likely to get the pro barefoot pages come up in your search engines first. And then on the flip side to this, and I consider this as more of the out groups of people, owners talked a lot about people forcing opinions on them. It was unsolicited advice. They described feelings of being made to feel guilty if you didn't do what had been suggested, and being made to feel guilty if your horse had then gone on to become ill. And a number of people talked about how ultimately you don't want to upset your yard owner. So if your yard owner disagrees or has a different point of view to you, you tend to either go along with it or you have to consider leaving the yard. And one of my owners here likened that to having a child at nursery, for example. The second one I want to talk about was yard restrictions. For me, it was no surprise that people on livery yards said that there were issues and restrictions they had in place around what they could do in terms of management. We think about limited turnout hours and having to protect fields, and that kind of thing. Owners also described going to a yard and selecting a yard based on what they'd been told they would be allowed to do, which ultimately then they weren't allowed. Perhaps what was more surprising to me was this was also seen of people who rented land and kept their horses privately. And I had one owner describe how they couldn't put up any fencing and how ideally they would like some hard standing and to put up some more shelter, but ultimately they weren't allowed to do this without permission. I also had people talk about how the facilities on the yards didn't really work for their horses. And everyone talked about how the grazing was not really suitable for horses. Predominantly, a lot of livery yards are based on ex-dairy land, or if it's equestrian, it tends to be those rich grasses for thoroughbreds. And when you own a native breed, it's not really suitable grazing for your horses. So I think this is a real problem that really needs to be addressed. Another thing that came up was the sort of setup of the livery yards and how a lot of horse owners have individual turnout or small paddocks with 1 or 2 horses. And this meant that if they wanted to do things like strip grazing or put in some sort of track system, they weren't able to do this because of the limited space. It was interesting that actually one of the owners I interviewed was also a yard owner, and they'd recently taken over this yard. And they said that they had this set up because ultimately that's what liveries were expecting. So they, even though that wasn't ideally how they wanted to keep the horses, that's kind of what they'd inherited. So moving on to information and accessibility. A lot of owners described how they tried to identify reputable sources to get information from. A number of more scientifically minded people talked about how they would try to get any scientific evidence for products that were recommended to them, and to read the scientific literature. Other people didn't really want to read the literature. They kind of felt that it was something that vets should read and understand. And then they wanted the information summarised to them, so either by their vet or using sort of well-known media who they expected to read and digest and summarise the research quite accurately. People did want to listen to their vets, but I think what was really interesting here is they were often reluctant to talk to vets about different issues. So one of the quotes here was around, even if their vet was there on the yard, perhaps seeing their horse for a different reason, because it wasn't relevant, they didn't feel like they could ask the question. Likewise, I had someone talk about the cost of getting a vet and how they didn't feel they had the time to talk to their vet. I think this is key in terms of laminitis, where we want to catch it early and prevent a horse from getting it in the first place. If you don't feel comfortable asking those questions and discussing it with your vet until your horse actually gets laminitis, it's too late by that stage. Owners also talked about how there was a lot of false information out there, particularly on the horse forums and the social media pages, and how sometimes it was really difficult to distinguish between good and bad science. And ultimately, there were some really damaging theories that were out there that people were telling each other. And finally, a number of people said that they didn't really feel they could understand research. So not only could they struggle to access the papers, when they didn't really understand them. So they did rely on people summarising them accurately for them in a way they could understand. So finally, I just want to talk about wanting the best for our horses. I think ultimately that's why we're all here. People do want the best for their horse. And they recognise that all horses are individuals and they all have different needs. And most of the horse owners I interviewed, their horses had multiple health issues, or they had concerns with their mental well-being and trying to balance that with their physical well-being. So the quote in green here talks about how this owner was worried, their horse was quite stressed, so they were worried about ulcers and didn't really want their horse standing in a stable with nothing to eat. But then on the same time, they were trying to balance that with how much food should they get, because they were worried about their horse being overweight and potentially getting laminitis. So although they want the best for their horse, they're not entirely sure in this situation what the best is. And it's quite difficult with advice out there when you're reading the websites. You know, you can read laminitis for advice, you can read ulcer advice, but you don't really know which one you should be listening to in that situation for your horse. And because of this, people recognised they did need to keep really close eyes on their horses and their general environment and adjust their management accordingly. It's not just a case of, you know, this is what I feed my horse and this is the turnout it has and we do this every single day of the year. They recognised that they needed to adjust these things based on their horse's weight or the weather or lots of different things that they needed to take into account. So just to sort of summarise, I wanted to come back to this behaviour model that I showed you earlier. So we can see that in terms of the personal factors, people said that they didn't really know where to get the knowledge from. struggle to interpret it, and sometimes in terms of if you go back to the social bubbles and things, their attitudes towards things might not correlate. So being told that you should use a grazing muzzle, for example, if you think that's cruel, then you're probably not going to do it. In terms of behavioural factors, now this is something that didn't really come up in my interviews too much, but again, using grazing muzzles as an example, if your horse frequently takes the muzzles off and you've tried, you know, half a dozen and none of them have stayed on, you might suddenly start feeling, well, actually, that's not something I can do. I think the big one that came out of was the environmental factors, so social norms, what goes on your livery yards, what are generally people's attitudes. I know people have had situations, for example, where they're on quite heavy showing yards, so then people have seen their horses and thinking they're underweight, so there's that kind of balancing. And I think from the livery yards issues, we've seen that people do have this problem in that they can't necessarily change their own environment. So I think we've identified a range of things that can stop owners from implementing the measures that we would recommend. And although you've probably listened to this thinking, well, we know all this, from a scientific point of view, it's very important to highlight these in a study. So then we've got the weight of evidence behind to say, look, this is a problem and we need to work together to remove some of these barriers. So a couple of examples that, you know, maybe things that we could think about is working with livery yards, for example, to improve setups and help aid horse management, while balancing the fact that all horses are individual and have different needs. And given the fact that people feel reluctant to go to their vets for sort of general prevention advice, are there other professionals there that we could help empower to be able to give advice, or at the very least signpost people to advice to help prevent things like laminitis? So I just want to acknowledge my supervisors who have helped me throughout my PhD, and finally to all the horse carers who have helped me throughout my study. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chantil. That was really fascinating. I love the whole sort of psychology of why we do the things we do and why we don't do the things we do, perhaps. So that was really cool, and we have asked people to pop questions in the chat so long, and we'll tackle them all at the end. So I will pass over now to Tamsin to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Chantil, and I love that pony in your picture. Oh my god, so cute.
That's my weekly hack.
Oh,
Amazing.
Look at his mane. Awesome, that's so interesting. I'm looking forward to the question. Thank you. Okay, so next we're very lucky to have our good friend Jo Hockenhull talk to us about a really difficult subject that we definitely all need to, you know, think about probably more than we do, sadly, even though it's hard, you know, hard to kind of broach it. So, you know, everyone who's here, you know, we totally understand and know and are on the same page and realise how hard it is. But, you know, well done for kind of making the effort to think about it in advance, I guess. So Jo is an animal behaviour and welfare research scientist at Bristol Vet School. And she's been involved in a range of research on different species, including leisure horses, cows, cetaceans, whales and dolphins and so on. But her passion's always been horses, and her thesis was really interesting actually. When I first met her, I was like, oh my god, I loved your thesis, being such a geek. And yeah, about what, like, looking at the prevalence of different behaviour problems and then what sorts of things they linked to in relation to you know, what was going on in horses' lives, and then what behaviour problems did they have as a result, which is a good read. I recommend it. So yeah, Jo has been riding since the age of 10, and she has an Irish cob called Oscar on part loan, who is super cute. So Jo's also been working with another friend, Janie Casper, looking at new ways of signposting different resources around equine euthanasia to make it easier for us all when we need to you know, think about those difficult times and think in advance and so on. So we're super excited to have her talk to us tonight. So I'll hand over to Jo, but yeah, feel free to pop any questions in the chat, and we will catch up with you after. So fire away, Jo.
Okay, right, let's try and work technology, which is always interesting. Ooh. What I was saying earlier about not letting people loose with your screen.
Technology. We can see it now.
I can't see anything because I can't see anything.
Yeah, brilliant. We can see the screen. We can see the presentation, but it's not in presenter view yet.
Okay, so I still can't see it, so I need to stop it and start again.
Don't worry.
Ooh, I'm learning, you see. I'm learning from Chantil.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Okay, now we can see it again, but not in presenter view.
I still can't see it, but I have another monitor, so it looks like I'm looking weirdly sideways from my camera, but that's the only way I can see my slides.
Okay.
Oh, no, it's appeared in front of me. This is
Yay,
even better.
we can see it now. Brilliant.
Yes, academic can work technology. A miracle.
Don't speak too soon.
No, oh dear. So I completely lost track of what I was doing because I was getting quite engrossed in what Chantil was saying, and then I suddenly realised I had to actually do some talking. So I just want to say at the beginning that I know this isn't an easy subject for a lot of people to think about. To make it more depressing, it's not really just about people with an elderly equine, and these are sort of issues you could really do with thinking about at every stage of your horse's life, and just having that knowledge in the background to help see you through. So if there is some kind of horsey emergency, you've done that research first and you know what's available to you, and you can act in your horse's best interests, and in the knowledge that you've had a look at all the options and you're doing the right thing. Because it is such a sensitive subject, I have got some support resources that I mention in here. For example, the Blue Cross Pet Bereavement Line, who are absolutely awesome. And make sure you reach out to people like that if this talk affects you in any way at all, anything I mention, and if you need those services going forward, because they're here to help and they really are really valuable resources to have. Right, I will kick on with it. Ooh, okay, right. As some background, you may have noticed that within recent years there's been a bit of a flurry of talking about issues like quality of life for horses, and also issues surrounding delayed euthanasia. Part of that, I don't know if you remember, but when the equine welfare crisis kicked off, it was over a decade ago, but obviously it's continuing, and a lot of the equine welfare charities were asking people to perhaps euthanize their horses, rather than try and hand them over to a charity if there was something wrong with them. And that's sort of come up in a lot of research when they've been looking at different factors that might be affecting the welfare of horses within the UK. So this is horses from every single sector they could think of, not just leisure horses, like race horses, competition horses, feral horses, all sorts of horses. But basically there's been two sort of quite in-depth scientific studies at this. Both were funded by welfare charities. So one was funded by World Horse Welfare and one was funded by the Animal Welfare Foundation. And both came up with very similar priorities. So firstly was poor recognition of pain in horses, as well as evidence of sort of fear and stress often weren't picked up on. And the other, like I said, was delayed euthanasia. In whichever form this took, whoever it was with, this was considered an ongoing welfare risk for our horses. So since these two different studies were published, one of them was obviously just this year, but certainly since Sue Horseman's study was published, a lot of the welfare charities really been putting a lot of effort into actually developing resources that they can share with horse owners, anyone basically who is involved in horses at any level, so vets, paraprofessionals, people like that, just to help guide people on how to explore and how to quantify quality of life in your horse. and also information about decisions regarding equine end of life. So there's a lot more information around now than there used to be. However, as I'll come on to in a minute, this is something obviously that came up in Chantil's talk. There is information out there. It is put together by trusted people, but a lot of us aren't aware that it exists. So I certainly wasn't until I started looking into this. So that is a lot of the point of this talk, really, is just to flag up. And I haven't done research in this area. This is literally just to flag up what is out there that can help us make these decisions and help us actually have the confidence and a framework to think about these things around, because often it's a bit of a like, how do I start thinking about this? Where do I start? What kind of framework do I use? And these resources help provide that kind of framework for you. So Tamsin gave me a lovely introduction there, bless her wee cotton socks. So I've been horsey for over 30 years now. There's another cute shameless picture of Ozzy, my part lone Irish cob, who is absolutely gorgeous. He was quite young here, so this is when he first came to the yard. He was 4. He's got a lot more hair these days, and I've got, well, grayer hair, so there we go. So yeah, I'm at Bristol Vet School. I've been there for 9 years now and done a lot of research on a lot of different welfare areas. Through my time on different yards, I don't have my own horse, but I've had Ozzy on loan for 9 years, and I ride other people's horses, or lots of other people's horses at different places. So obviously, inevitably, with that kind of time around horses, you do experience some loss, and some of those horses have been very close to me, and I had absolutely no idea about some of these things I'm going to share with you today. So some of you might know they exist already. I was completely oblivious, and it wasn't till I got talking to Janie Casper at an Equine Welfare Conference that she said, well, basically she'd had exactly the same experience. She wasn't aware of some of these things either. So we thought we'd develop this equine signposting project, which is basically what it says on the tin. We just want to share useful resources to help people like us with our horses in a totally non-judgmental way. We're not saying this is what you should do. We're just saying this is what's out there, and then it's your choice whether you use it or not. Sure. Right. So what if, right, on to the nitty gritty bit. So in terms of what quality of life is, I'm more at home in doing the sort of animal welfare scientist approach, and I've been doing a lot of work, as Tamsin said, with cows, and this is actually a framework that came from the Farm Animal Welfare Council. And so the arrowy bit in the middle is actually a continuum of welfare. We often just think of welfare in terms of negative welfare, but it's actually a continuum that goes from poor welfare to positive, great welfare. And we're hoping our horses are on the upper side, the good welfare side of that continuum. Running alongside this, we've started to think about quality of life. So in this initial report, this was 2009 from the Farm Animal Welfare Council, they basically categorised quality of life in 3 ways. So they had a life that's not worth living at all for the animal, a life that was worth living, but perhaps didn't necessarily have any highlight moments of pleasure or joy, and then a good life, which would encompass what we'd like to see our horses having. So times of pleasure, times when they're having fun, you know, they don't want for anything, they're having a general positive, yay, I enjoy my life kind of moment. So when this was sort of first discussed in relation to farm animal welfare, everyone was a bit like, ooh, but it's actually being taken on a lot now, and where we see it used more outside of research and production animals is definitely within our companion animal species. So I've got many other animals. I don't have a horse, but I have 3 dogs and 3 rabbits and 3 guinea pigs and a mouse who is behind me. So this started coming up at the vet, and I was seeing more stuff in the vet practice of information on thinking about quality of life of our companion animals. And as ever, we always see the horsey world is lagging slightly behind the doggy world. So we are gaining quality of life type discussions within our horses, but perhaps not as far along as we are in other species. One thing that is important to point out really is quality of life is really an ongoing thing. So while it's quite tempting just to think of it as something we ponder at the end of our animal's life, it is something to really have in mind throughout their whole life. And that really gives us a better way of understanding our animals, what's actually important to them, and what we can do to improve their quality of life, and what changes or what might happen that might perhaps take that a little bit down the continuum to perhaps more of a life worth living. Yes, life worth living rather than a good life. So essentially there's two ways of thinking about quality of life. One of them is really trying to think about and identify what is important to the animal itself. And so for our horses, it might be the opportunity to enjoy themselves playing with other horses. It might be they enjoy a good role. They like to be able to eat comfortably. The second part of thinking about quality of life is what can we actually use from that to help us make decisions about the quality of life our horses are living. So for example, for rolling, it might be, well, do they feel confident that they can actually get down to the ground, that they can have their roll and then stand up again? Are they showing reluctance to eat? Is there evidence that they might not be eating as comfortably as perhaps they want to? Have they started avoiding interactions with other horses, perhaps because they're not feeling 100% and they're a bit worried or protecting part of themselves that they perhaps damaged? So we've got the what's important for the horse as far as we can tell, and then we've got the different indicators that we can use to think about that, and that sort of provides us now a more objective framework to start thinking about quality of life. And essentially we need to use a combination of both. And it's worth pointing out here that, you know, this is subjective. It's most of us know our horses well. We think we know what makes them happy. We think we know what makes them tick, but it is us assuming their preferences rather than them telling us. And it's always good to have that at the back of your mind, just as a caveat. And I say again there, it's just so important to monitor quality of life throughout the life of our horses, particularly horses being horses. We know how good they are at getting themselves into trouble in one way or another. And if you've had a horse that's perhaps, you know, they might only be fairly young, but they've injured themselves, and you want to evaluate the kind of quality of life they're living now post-injury, it would really benefit you to have something to compare that against, because it's very easy, and I guess this comes across a bit with what Chantal was saying, it's very easy as a human, you naturally try and seek something that confirms what you're thinking. So if we want to see that our horse is doing fine, we'll be like, oh, well, they didn't roll that much anyway, so it's okay that they can't really do that comfortably anymore. But if you've got that kind of record, you've been monitoring their quality of life on a long-term basis, it does give you more objective evidence you can look at and say, well, actually, they did used to roll quite a lot and now they're not doing that. So maybe they're not as comfortable as I think I am, I think. And it doesn't have to lead to, I mean, euthanasia is like oh my God, it's the total endpoint decision. It might just be that, look, they're not comfortable rolling. I need to talk to my vet. And perhaps we can do something different in terms of painkillers and make their lives a bit more comfortable, because they're not as happy as I would like them to be, and perhaps is possible for them to be. And there's often a wide range of treatment before it ever gets to the euthanasia point, and it's worth remembering that. In terms of starting to look at quality of life for yourself, the British Horse Society and the Donkey Sanctuary have both got some brilliant resources. They've sort of developed PDFs that you can download, and they've got different frameworks and different things you can think about for your horse. think BHS one is like, can your horse still do that, yes or no? The donkey sanctuary one's a bit more open, but you can take, it's basically, you can pick a mix. You don't have to follow an existing protocol. It's just what works for you and your horse. So if you think you know what's important for your horse, then base it around that. You can just get some ideas from some of these tools or not, as you see fit, but they're out there if you want to have a look at them and see what you think and then adapt them to work for you. I think one of the most important things to say is it's so important to have confidence in yourself, because most of us, we're the ones that spend time with our animals. We know them. Part of this is spending time together, and a lot of us just do that for fun because that's the kind of people we are. We don't just have horses to ride them, we hang out with them, we like to play with them, we like to groom together, and we like to spend time together. So that kind of contact will really help us to understand what is important for our horse, again feeding into the quality of life. But it also helps us to recognise when something changes. So once we know what normal is, and this is where it really helps to spend time with your horse in different contexts, so perhaps hang out with them in the field, not just when you bring them into the yard to groom them or to feed them, but just see how they interact in lots of different situations will really give you a proper all-round view of what is normal for that individual. Keeping a diary can be really useful. It doesn't have to be like, today Oscar and I decided to go for a walk down here and we encountered Roger the farmer and we did this. It can just literally be just one thing you notice, you know, Ozzy seemed like very clingy today. But, you know, it's just noting stuff like that down, because looking back, it can be really helpful to try and identify changes over time, or perhaps even any patterns forming. So when I've spoken to people that have actually used this, because to be honest, I'm like the worst person at keeping a diary of all time, and I've tried it so many times for myself, and he's like, yeah, you write down positive things that happen every day to keep you happy. Yeah, hopeless at that as well, but just writing down these odd notes here and there will just really help you spot that kind of change. And it can simply be like, maybe the hay bale's changed, maybe it's a different type of hay and he's not eating quite the same, maybe he's started pooing in a different area of the field. And it might be you find out later that, you know, there was something going on, there was some like shooting nearby and he was worried, so he went to a different area of the field. But just being able to objectively note down that kind of information can really help. And it also means if you need to talk to your vet, you've got that kind of evidence with you, and it's something you can actually discuss together. So I lost my dog earlier this year and he was in chronic pain, and I did keep some kind of written record for him, and I have to say it really helped me when I was evaluating when the time might be for him, is just to have that kind of thing to rely on. Made me more confident in the decision than I think I would have been otherwise. It just gave me that bit of crutch and that bit of confidence that I wasn't just randomly picking a time out of thin air. I was actually basing it on something. Because the other thing that can be quite scary, and it is scary how quickly this happens, so your horse might be changing over time, my dog changed over time, and it sort of becomes normal for them somehow without you even realizing that it has been a change. So looking back, you might go, well, yeah, I'm sure they used to play more than that, but I haven't actually seen him playing for a while. But that can become the new normal. My horse just doesn't play as much as other horses. So again, monitoring really helps you just recognize that kind of thing. And it will also help sort of flag up when you're actually, yeah, it might be time to get the vet's opinion, not to talk about euthanasia necessarily, not to discuss end of life, but just to say, I've spotted these things. Is this actually, do you think this is important? Do you have any recommendations? Do you think we need to think about perhaps painkiller regimes? And have that conversation, because Although I know Chantel said that, you know, often we are reluctant to talk to our vets. They are bloody expensive, and they can seem a bit in a rush sometimes, but essentially that is their job, and it's supposed to be more of a partnership. It's supposed to be both invested in the care of your horse. And I think a lot of vets these days are aware that things have shifted a bit. They don't want to be the reactive firefighters that just come out when horses are injured or ill. They want to be more sort of proactive and help people actually work with them to sort of create health plans for horses and ongoing life plans. And certainly there's been a massive switch in sort of farm vets, and they've definitely gone over to this more proactive style. We're seeing a lot about health plans and companion animals. Again, as usual, horses are lagging behind, but I think that change is certainly rumbling in some vet practices, and I think that can only really be a positive thing for those of us that sort of want to work more closely with our vets about these kind of issues. I think if you've got to make an end of life decision that's not because of an emergency, knowing when the time is right is perhaps the hardest thing, and making the decision at that time. Thinking about it is always horrendous. The aftermath is obviously also horrendous, but when it's still down to you to make that choice, I think that is a natural horrible moment. And I think that's why having, like I said, having some evidence behind you can really help. And you hear a lot of people, and we had this so much on the yards I've been at, I'll know when it's time to let my horse go. Had a lot of owners just wanting to give them one last summer, one last, you know, well, the moment they come in for winter housing, then that will be the point that I'll make the decision. I think it's always going to be hard. I think it's important to realise that other people will always have different opinions. Like Chantel was saying on the yard, there's always going to be that know-it-all person that thinks you've made the decision too early, too late. What you're doing is cruel, what you're doing is wrong. But it's you doing the best you can for your horse. And although it's absolutely so hard at that time, especially if you've got people like that making comments about what you're doing, this is where having your quality of life monitoring and having your vet support is absolutely vital, so that you're not doubting yourself at this point, because the worst thing in the world is to have that kind of regret afterwards. I think if you're looking back at your time with your horse and all you can see is, I didn't make that decision soon enough and they suffered, I think that's a really sad way to be, when there's so much help out there to help you make that decision earlier. Yeah, so I think it's important to get it right for the horse. It's also important to get it right for you, so that you're not having those regrets and having to live with those afterwards. Because I know a lot of people that's now their abiding memory of their horse was, I let it go on too long, and I don't think that's a situation where any of us really want to be in. So the BHS have got amazing resources on equine end of life planning and quality of life, and this is something that they put out on their Facebook group. Better a week too soon than a day too late, and I think that's a sentiment that, as hard as it may be, most of us can actually appreciate. So in the end, with my dog, I ended up perhaps doing the week too soon. He was still totally bonkers, but I could see he had got worse, but he hadn't reached the stage where he couldn't stand up and he couldn't do stuff. But I didn't want him to get to that stage. But then obviously I had the people who were just like, well, he doesn't look too bad to me, he was still trying to play. but at least I'm confident in my decision that he didn't get to the point where he was really suffering. He was on suitable painkiller regime, and that was okay. But it is surrounding this issue which you inevitably, if you're on a livery yard, get comments from people asking you why you did it at that point because they thought your horse was still okay. Equally, why did you leave that long? You won't ever be able to win, and it's important just to be able to filter out that kind of comment, however hard it is, just for your own peace of mind. But there are, I think it's here, oh no, in a couple of slides time, I've got some sort of information that support lines that you can use. So if you are in that situation where you're doubting yourself or you want to talk it through with someone neutral, there are people out there that can help you, and it's really important to use those resources. So when it comes to the actual the process, what's going to happen, and again, remember this can happen at any age, so it's quite tempting to put off this kind of thing. No one wants to think about losing their horse, but it can unfortunately happen at any time. So putting the research in now, hopefully long before it's needed, means that at least you sort of know what the options are, and you've done that hard work. So when it comes down to it, you can just focus on you and your horse, rather than having a sudden panic about you're not really sure who to call, what to do, what your options are. Obviously, your vet is your best person to talk this kind of thing through with. Some vets are actively promoting working with their clients to produce an end-of-life plan for the horse. World Horse Welfare have an owner's plan that you can download, and basically it's your preferred choices in an ideal situation. So if it's not an emergency, what you'd like to happen with your horse, what process, and where you'd like them to end up. There were so many, I don't know if you saw it, sort of when lockdown started and people weren't sure they could actually get to visit their horses, I saw quite a few livery yards actually discussing this, and saying they really wanted owners to have a plan in place, because if the worst happened and the owner couldn't get to their horse at this time, they really wanted to make sure they were doing the right thing by that horse and for the owner. So it really gives you sort of different topics. Topics sounds really clinical, I didn't mean it like that. So different things to think about at that point in time. So if you've got people that you'd like to be with you, having their names and contact numbers in a plan would be really important. What option you'd like, whether you want, just starting to think about sort of whether you'd want to be there, that kind of thing. Just having it written down doesn't mean it's set in stone. You can tweak it, you can change it anytime, but it does mean that you've got something there. Should the worst happen, you don't have to be worrying about that kind of decision making at that point. And again, share it with those people that are close to you, that you'd like to be there, and share it with the people on the yard, not necessarily all the people on the yard, but perhaps the yard owner, and obviously your vet, because hopefully it will be something that you've discussed together. So you've got that written down in case the worst should happen. So there's a couple of resources. I mean, obviously your vet's your best port of call, because they'll know what they offer directly, because they'll be the ones doing it. So they'll be able to talk you through exactly how it will work in your individual situation for your individual horse. But there's some different resources online that basically just describe the different stages of the process, so the different options available in terms of injection, or whether you'd like to go through alternatives. So they've got information on sort of the different stages of the process. Obviously it's all, I mean, they've done a really good job of making it. I mean, it's not stuff any owner wants to read about, but they've tried to make it as sensitively written as they can. So the first one, with you every step of the way, is basically Equine welfare charities, World Horse Welfare, British Horse Society and Blue Cross together have come out with this guidance that takes you through every stage of the process. So it includes your quality of life, your end of life planning, and where you can get support from for the process. The donkey sanctuary stuff is actually brilliant, and so much of it applies for horses as well as donkeys, so it's definitely worth a look. And then the other one I flagged up there, so the National Foal and Stock Company have launched an equine end of life service. So they give some really nice, well presented sort of information on the decisions and the actual sort of practicality, what would happen and whether your horse is shot or whether they're injected, and what will happen in terms of taking your horse away afterwards. And obviously that sort of is a service. These people are working with the National Foal and Stock Company, but it's got some good information. It tells you, it helps you find local contacts if you need to. I think for most people, their vets help sort out that side of things. But if they don't, that's a company that or a site you can go to help find a local person in your area. So I think a lot of this, and it's just horrible to think about, but we need to think that if we do plan it in advance, if we do think about what options are available to us, we're sort of more likely to get it right for both our horses and ourselves. Your vet is really the best person to talk about this with, but other owners may have experiences that might be useful for you. Sadly, most of us know people that have gone through this, and it is hard, but people genuinely want to either help other people have the sort of same experience that they did, if it was peaceful, if it was calm, if it was well planned out, so that it wasn't all hectic and stressful and nasty at the end. So do your own research, have a look at these sites so you can actually make these decisions from a place of knowledge, and think about, you know, what would work for you given your particular horse in your particular situation. Have a think about what you might like to happen after, and again, you don't need to stick with this, but just think about, you know, would you like your horse cremated? Obviously there's massive financial implications if you want them cremated on their own as opposed to with other horses. Again, it's thinking about that at that point, because at the point when you're actually losing your horse, it can be very, very difficult to actually have a clear enough head to make that kind of decision. And the last thing you want is to look back and think, oh God, why did I do that? It's also, you know, if your horse is being taken away to be cremated, and it might be someone that the vet works with closely that they recommended, but for your peace of mind, it might be worth checking them out as well. And this is purely based on my personal experience. I have someone that I know that looked into it afterwards, and they were concerned that their horse wasn't treated perhaps with the same dignity that they would have liked, and they weren't convinced that what they got back was their horse's ashes, and just living with that was just awful for them. So however difficult it is, putting a bit of time in now is really worth it, not to have that kind of regret afterwards. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There's so many people that have been through it, and I think it's the next slide. I've got some people that you can ask for help if you're going through this process. But sort of saying, in the end, we can only do the best we can in our particular situation. Don't beat yourself up about things that you can't change and you can't control. So in terms of support available, British Horse Society, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, run a scheme called Friends at the End. So pre-COVID, this was a face-to-face service as well, and I think they might still be doing this in a limited way since the pandemic, but they provide telephone support, and they actually, depending on your area, can actually provide someone that will come out and be with you at the end if you don't want to be on your own and you haven't got anyone else you can ask. There's people, they've been trained with bereavement counsellors, they know their stuff, and they're happy to talk to you before the decision's made, when you're at that process, when you're just thinking about it, and sort of during the process when you're making that decision, and then after when you're experiencing the loss of your horse. Simply so you're not alone. That's an amazing service, and definitely something, I mean, I had no idea this existed, definitely something that we should be proud of, that we've got that kind of thing for us. The Blue Cross provides a pet bereavement service. Again, this is with trained counsellors. Again, they're happy to talk you through the decision-making process and support you before loss of life, not just afterwards. So although they're called the bereavement service, the conversations I have, you know, it's a whole life thing. It's not just after you've lost your animal. It's a support right through the whole process. So they're definitely worth bringing. So they've got a phone number and an email support service there. It's also worth noting here that euthanasia isn't also quite significantly affects our vets and our vet nurses, and there are resources out there that they can speak to if they're similarly affected by loss. So it's just worth flagging up for any of you that may be vets or have veterinary contacts. When the time comes, there might be things that you can think about at the end. So when we lost a horse on our yard, he'd been on box rest for months. He had laminitis related to Cushing's, and his pedal bone rotated, and it turns out the vets recommended euthanasia, and they actually nerve blocked him for the rest of the day so that he could spend some time out grazing with his friends, which he hadn't been able to do. So that was how we could remember him, and he had that time at the end, so it wasn't just him having been stuck on box rest and then losing his life. We actually got to see him out doing what he loved to do. Other people might give their horse all their favourite foods. My dog was basically put to sleep with a block of cheese in his mouth, and that made him very happy, and it meant a lot to me. Strange. Sorry, getting a bit personal here. So in terms of practicalities, that's something you might want to think about. Make sure you tell other people on the yard what is going on, because the last thing in the world you want is someone walking in at the completely wrong moment. Think about whether you want to be there at the end yourself, to be with your horse. Again, it's a completely personal choice. Don't ever feel that you should be judged for doing it one way or the other. It's your choice and what you want for your horse. There is the option, a lot of vets will say that they can bring someone out from their practice if you personally don't want to be there right at that point, or the BHS friends at the end scheme might be able to send somebody out to be with your horse at that moment. In terms of what happens afterwards, some vets will stay and wait for whoever's coming to take your horse away. They might clear things up if that's necessary. It might be worth thinking about whether you want someone to come and make sure everything's tidied up for when you get back down the yard, or whether you actually want to do some stuff yourself. Again, this is completely personal choice. There aren't right or wrongs, but particularly obviously if your horse is being shot, you might want to make sure that someone's actually going to clean up before you go back down there. letting your other horses say goodbye, again, total personal choice. I know some people determined that they want their horses' friends to be able to say goodbye to them. Other people just don't need that on top of what they're experiencing themselves. I think whichever way you choose, recognise that whatever those horses do when faced with your horse's body is not a reflection of their grief necessarily. So when Oscar's best friend, when we lost him, Oscar just went over to the body and sort of looked at it and then just started grazing. And it actually really, really upset the owner, who just felt that Oscar didn't care that he had lost his friend. And that's a horse reaction, you know, they don't grieve in the same way we do. And so recognising that they will do what they need to do and not to take it personally is actually really, really important. Some things that people put in their end of life plan is perhaps if they want a memento of their horse, so if they'd like some mane or tail hair, or if they'd like to keep one or all of the shoes. Again, having that kind of thing in the end of life plan just means that you don't have to try and remember that, because that's the kind of thing that will just completely go out your mind. And again, it might be something that you regret not doing if you didn't remember it at the time. I put memorials there. That's sort of often quite a long time after, but just bearing in mind that most people like to do something and mark their horse in some way. And that can actually be something to vaguely positive to hang on to in what can be a really difficult time. It just gets more depressing by the slide, I am so sorry. So just to touch quickly on grieving, we've probably all been subject to this at some point, with some lovely person coming up to us and telling us, oh, well, it's only a horse, I don't know why you're so upset. There is actually a name for this, and there are people that do research in this area and are trying to change that kind of perception. So it's technically called disenfranchised grief, and that basically means that you're grieving, but you're made to feel by society or by people in society that it has no proper basis. We all know, we all love our horses, and we all know there is most certainly a basis for grieving them. So whatever you do, do not ever feel that you shouldn't be able to grieve them. But recognise it's an individual process. We all have our different ways of grieving. Some people might want to post repeatedly every 5 minutes on social media about their grief and their loss. Other people might just take themselves away and remove themselves from social contact. Either way is completely legitimate, and it's fine because it's an individual thing to do. There are different things that people do for comfort. Things like tree planting as a memorial, making photo books of their horse, writing down all the little habits and important memories. But just remember that you're not alone through this process, and use those support lines if you need to. There's no need for you to grieve alone if you don't want to be alone in your grief. So now I have totally depressed you. I'm so sorry. I hope there was some use in between all the nasty bits to think about. I really want to say that as part of having this kind of amazing relationship with our horses, we do have a responsibility for them to prevent them from suffering if we can. And it's horrible for us, but equally suffering isn't too great for them. So I guess I just wanted to highlight the value of getting to know your horse. And most of us, we do that and we sort of take it for granted that we know who they are, but to write it down and enjoy that knowledge that you have of them as an individual. Make some kind of record so you can look back and you can monitor changes over time. Think about we don't like to think about it, but think about end of life, and the time to do it is before the end. It's not a shock. It's not suddenly something you have to think about when your brain is all over the place. You've thought about it in advance and you shared that plan. And I think that's so important going forward with COVID. If we're all going to be in lockdown in different places at different times, having a plan where you can actually share what you want to happen with your horse in case you can't make it there. Although I think most of us would just break lockdown to be there if we can. Having that in writing is really important. And with all the will in the world, if it's an emergency situation and they can't wait for you to arrive, at least if your wishes are written down, that they will be able to, hopefully as much as they can, honour those wishes. Respect individual differences. We make different decisions. We think things are important that other people perhaps don't. Stick to your guns. You know your horse, and it's you that knows what's best for them, not random people on your yard. Use the resources that are out there. I mean, the charities have invested so much time and effort in making these resources, and I felt awful. I had absolutely no idea this kind of thing existed. I'm hoping that perhaps you knew more than I did, but yeah, use what's out there and pass it on to people that might benefit from it. And I think most importantly, remember you're not going through this process alone. In a cheesy way, I think this has always really summed it up for me. And I don't just apply this for horse owners. This is my humans versus animal welfare. We have power over all the animals that we have in our lives, that we can affect the way they live and the choices that we make affect them. And I think remembering that we have that power and we also have a responsibility to do what's right. So I will quote Uncle Ben from Spider-Man in Reveal My Inner Geek. Lastly, I'd just like to shamelessly plug my project with Janie. So this is the Equine signposting project. It is literally just a page on Facebook with lots of links to different resources, but we're just hoping it makes that easier for people to find information that might be useful. We're not just including information on equine end of life. It will have lots of other information about lots of different subjects, but we wanted to start off with quite a few of the end of life links because it's such an important subject, and it is really something that we need to be thinking about. So it's not like a chatty, commenty type Facebook page. It is literally just a load of links, but you can message us on there if you think we've missed anything that a trusted source has put out, and we'll be happy to share that if we can. So yeah, thank you for sticking with me. I know it's been hard. If you've been affected by what I've been saying, please make use of some of the resources that I've mentioned, or the Samaritans obviously there. Don't feel like you're alone in this, and I hope you're all okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jo. Really, really good talk. And I think, like you say, we often tend to think about quality of life and sort of end of life decisions with our older horses. But as you say, it's something we should be evaluating sort of throughout their lives. And I think just last week, Nottingham University and the BHS had the Colic Awareness Week, you know, and then talking about really similar things like this, making a plan for when it does come to that situation where, you know, it might be an emergency colic surgery that's needed or something. You know, start thinking about a plan, and that'll kind of help you a little bit than rather making a really panicked decision.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was thinking about this in relation to having lost my elderly horse, Red, who was the one on the picture for the event, and she was 33 or so when we lost her, and I must have spent about 4 years beforehand thinking about, you know, like just worrying about making the decision and would I make it at the right time, and that horrible thing of you know, a week too early is great, but at the same time, how do you know if it's not a week too early, actually they would have been fine for another 4 years or whatever. And yeah, really so tough making those decisions. And you know, that was a really powerful presentation and very emotional. Thank you. And I just thought maybe Emma has made a really nice comment about that we shouldn't think of it as being depressing. We should think about it in terms of making sure that we're doing the best for our horses and they're lucky and they know nothing about it, and we should celebrate the fact that actually we're doing our best to be responsible for them and make the right decision for them. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, that maybe doesn't make it any easier making the decision, but you know, it's true. I guess we're doing the best that we can for them.
That was the sort of tone I started off going, and it's one of those things, the more you talk about it, then it all just comes to the surface, then you end up totally being not like the independent person talking about it, just like, oh. So yeah, perfect, Emma. That's sort of what I was trying to say, but totally fair one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, sorry.
I was just going to say, and we actually have a lady here called Claire, who is actually a volunteer BHS welfare advisor and a friend at the end. So it's lovely to have someone like that here. And one person, I think she's left now, it was Anne, brought up the fact about, you know, feeling guilty if you can't financially keep your horse going. And obviously, I'll let you talk about that, Joe, but if you want to sort of, you know, talk about you want to do what's best for your horse, but you can't afford it, and then you might feel guilty about having them put down because you can't afford further care.
Yeah, and I think what we need to think about in that respect is that by putting them down, that is the best for them in that particular situation. If we can't afford to do whatever it, you know, because we don't have endless pots of money, most of us can't afford that thing. And I think that's what the charities were so keen to point out, was that if you're in that situation, there's something wrong with your horse, it's by absolute far the best thing to do is to put them down, rather than try and find someone that might take the horse on, that might be able to afford the care for a little bit longer, but maybe not. But they can end up being passed around from place to place to place, and actually their welfare will be so much worse. And as we've said, they don't know. It's a horrible decision for us to have to make, but for the horse, they're not going to be sort of mourning the life they haven't got to live. They're not going to be aware of that. I think the risks are just too great, that their welfare can just be so compromised. And guilt is a horrible thing. It's a totally human thing. I think whatever we do in this situation, we end up beating ourselves up afterwards, no matter how well we plan something, how well we monitor our horses. We manage to always find some little way of feeling guilty. But totally don't feel guilty if you've had to make that choice.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, should we all take a breath and invite Chantil back as well? And then we've got quite a few questions. Hi again, Chantil.
Hi.
Thank you for everyone who's shared their experiences as well, particularly about euthanasia there. I know it's really tough to talk about that. And, I guess it's important that we get talking about it. So thank you if you brave it enough to share good stuff.
And I think, like Tamsin, like you said very nicely, kind of you make the decisions you think are right at the time, and you know, thinking back and trying to beat yourself up about afterwards when you can't change. You can only do what you can do with the things that you have, as Joe said. So thank you everyone for sort of sharing those experiences, as Tamsin said, and yeah, we're all just trying to do the best we can.
Okay, so we've got quite a few different questions, but maybe if we'll just kind of start at random. What we usually do is Dee does one, I do one, and then you know, we might add in our own if we think of anything. So Emma said, and I think this was in relation probably more to your talk, Chantil, but so she was saying about this thing, I think it sounded like a lot of people were really interested in that idea, which does relate to euthanasia as well, of you know, us being in kind of bubbles, and how those bubbles really become echo chambers. And I know that's something I found in my research as well, that you know, we listen to the people who we want to listen to, and you know, who say the things that we agree with, and then they tell us our opinions back at us, and then that, you know, we feel good about it. But it's quite hard when we need new information, because we have to open to that. So Emma said she follows Barefoot Pages and finds the same thing, and that people can be very extreme and put everyone in boxes. And then on that subject, she said, how culpable do you think the feed and rug companies are in promoting irresponsible but well-meant rugging and feeding and so on? And, you know, makes the point, of course, that in our magazines and so on that we rely on, then they, you know, they're relying on sponsorship from those companies. So what do you say about that kind of thing, and where we get information from?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, really, isn't it? I mean, I think feed companies and like rugging companies could be a little bit better with these things. I mean, I noticed, and certainly a lot of horse owners talked about the guidance on the back of feed packets about you know, what feed they do, and how it's one of them was saying about how it's kind of, if your horse does dressage, you should feed it this much, which actually doesn't really take into consideration you know, how much dressage you're doing. Obviously, you know, if you're competing every week and, you know, practicing really hard, that's very different to someone who considers themselves as having a dressage horse that actually only compete, you know, at local shows once every 3 months or so. So I think quite often the problem is that the advice they give is too simplistic. Obviously, you know, we have this issue about, you know, people not understanding information and finding it too complicated, so you have to kind of make it as simple as possible. But what happens then is it's kind of, you try and give this very generic information and you lose the fact that horses are individuals. So so I think, you know, it's a difficult balance, really. I think you do need to try and the companies do need to take a bit of responsibility and try and issue appropriate guidance and help where they can. But I think horse owners also need to be aware of their own horse, which they generally are, and, you know, find that balance. And, you know, I know it's really difficult if you're on a show yard and everyone's horses have got rugs on, and you're actually thinking, well, mine doesn't really need a rug, it's a native breed and it's fine. So, you know, I think it's sometimes difficult to challenge that, but I think it's being about being strong about, you knowing your horse. And as Joe said about the euthanasia, ultimately you know about your horse's quality of life, and you know if they're cold and need a rug, or actually if they're fine and they don't. So I think, you know, it's being comfortable in your own decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Right, shall I go for one? Let's see. So I think we spoke a little bit about some horse owners' reluctance to talk to their vets because they think, oh, you know, the vet's in a rush and I want to ask him loads of questions, but I just don't feel like I can. So what do you think vets could potentially do to kind of break down this barrier, and maybe, as Joe also said, work more as partners with the horse owner, looking after their horse?
I think it's tricky, and so as part of my PhD I also interviewed a number of vets, and they talk about how horse owners tend to, when it comes to vaccines, tend to shop around, so they don't necessarily stay with the same vet practice each year. So building up a relationship is really difficult when you've got a healthy horse who ultimately every year is going to see a different vet. I think the relationships are much easier to build up when you've got a horse that perhaps does have various health conditions that require seeing that vet regularly. I mean, I think vets could perhaps, when they come for the vaccines, I think that is at least somewhere where they could put a foot in the door and try and talk about some of these issues, and perhaps allow time to discuss things like this. And then maybe if someone knows that they can talk about, you know, there's all these supplements, do you think it will benefit my horse because it's, you know, a bit stiff or whatever, perhaps if they know they can have that conversation, then they're more likely to stick with the same vet each time rather than go somewhere where the vaccines are a bit cheaper. next year.
Yeah. And I think as Jo also mentioned, sort of more vet practices are getting on board with kind of doing more preventive advice for horse owners. So BEVA, the British Equestrian Veterinary Association, did a trial where they would bring up talking about the horse's weight at the annual vaccinations. So it was a little bit of kind of advice for the future, and not just waiting until maybe that horse got laminitis and then talking about their weight. So
yeah, it's interesting because I know from my vet interviews, vets often feel that that their advice isn't kind of necessarily, especially around weight, isn't necessarily kind of wanted, and that it's really difficult to bring up. So I think it's this kind of two-way street where both feels like kind of maybe both sides would like more interaction and more of a kind of personal relationship, but at the same time it's quite hard to bridge the gap that we already have. It's interesting. Jo, did you have any thoughts on that in terms of end of life care?
I think I guess sort of what Chantil was saying, basically, your vaccine does provide the opportunity to start having that kind of discussions and talking to people about sort of perhaps putting some kind of plan in place. And it is just so different, the relationship horse owners have with their vets compared to sort of companion animal owners and vets, and farmers and vets. And it does seem to be a bit weirdly cultural. I've done vet interviews for many different species, and the horse owner one's always quite weird because there is this gap. But I think having something like sort of an end of life plan to talk about, to perhaps facilitate the discussion, or talking about weight, or talking about something else that relate, that you've got a reason to talk, and you've got some kind of like structured thing you can follow, perhaps might ease vets into it a bit, and I guess sort of help owners out that way. I think in terms of I work at the vet school, I'm not particularly involved in the teaching side of things, but there's so much they have to cram in their time, but awareness is definitely growing about the importance of including that kind of thing, and changing sort of the culture around being a vet and what that means. In terms of equine end of life, I know the Blue Cross are, amongst others, sort of planning to work on adding bits to the curriculum, on sort of facilitating discussions around that, and helping vets cope with, because I think a lot of it, people are wary about talking about end of life because they're like, oh, please don't cry at me, or I'm not sure I can cope with, it's natural, you just take it on board. So helping vets manage that kind of emotion will also help them in their conversations to have that kind of conversation more openly with owners than perhaps they feel they can at the moment.
Absolutely. Also, I guess we should say as well, like we're talking about vets, and obviously, your vet is the person definitely to take the advice from about how healthy your horse is, but equally most people have other professionals in their lives who are, I was quite surprised by the number of farriers in I think probably all the projects we've worked on who are desperate to have, to talk to people more particularly around weight, laminitis, and sometimes end of life care, because it can be the case with things like stiffness, for example, that your farrier is so well placed to comment on how actually your horse is really struggling to pick up its feet, and it's they're well placed because they see every 2 months, 6 weeks, or however often they come out, to kind of help be an objective advisor on that. Or if you've got, whoever you trust, your livery yard manager. I think with Reds, I had a really good friend who also helped me look after her. And I said to her, can you, be my objective? I trusted her. We had quite similar opinions on, ethics and end of life. And it was really helpful to me to know that I had kind of backup from someone who I trusted and could talk to me objectively about how she thought quality of life was, because I was scared that I might miss something or, make the wrong choice or whatever. So I guess that there are other people as well. So if you, so I know some people, like Claire's just put a lovely comment saying she's had really great advice from her vet and a really good relationship with them, which is fantastic. If you don't have that, anyone who you trust, and you feel like you can ask for their help.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe talk, so this will actually cover both topics sort of during our horses' lives and when we're thinking about sort of end of life, but kind of that when you have people, for example, shared ownership, or you have different people looking after the same horse who might have very different opinions on managing the horse, which can be quite difficult. You know, if, for example, like you'll put a grazing muzzle on and that person will take it off, or, you know, you'll take the rug off and they'll put it back on, and that sort of thing. But then also translating when it does come to end of life, and you might have very, you know, strong differing opinions. One person will say it's not time yet, and the other person will say yes, it's time, and it can be sort of escalate things and break down relationships. So maybe if we start off with Chantil, like, do you have any suggestions of how you might sort of deal with this, or?
It's difficult. I mean, I think trying to balance the opinions, essentially in that situation, you should have a good relationship. You should be able to, you know, communicate. So I think it's a case of, you know, discussing it really. So if you've got the different views of, you know, what are the pros and cons, and try to find some common ground and balance it. I mean, I think it's kind of difficult because I come from the position of having shared a horse, and I didn't necessarily agree with the owner, but it was very much of, that's the horse's owner, so I'm going to have to go with what they say. So I think, yeah, ultimately that's one of the reasons why I stopped sharing that particular horse. So I do think you need to try and find that balance and have those discussions, and there might be reasons that you've not considered. So I think that's important to think about.
Thank you. And Joe, if you had in, I was just thinking, because I had a sort of that sort of situation recently at my yard where we sort of, it's an older horse who is starting to struggle with arthritis and that sort of thing, and the owner and sharer sort of, you could almost think of them as two owners because they both invest so much time and care into the horse, but they had sort of the horse went down, and sort of he can get back up, but it is a little bit of a struggle. And sort of one lady was saying, you know, it's time now, and she would like the horse put down, but the other lady just thought this was absolutely terrible timing, and it's not his time yet, and he's still very happy and healthy. So fortunately, they talked it through at the end, but sort of when you're in that kind of position, and any kind of helpful advice as to should you try and get involved in mediate, or as you say, kind of maybe just signpost them to resources that are available.
Yeah, I think this is really highlights the importance of having this kind of discussion before anything actually goes wrong, so that when the time comes, you sort of already set out your different viewpoints without that kind of emotional situation hanging over you, because that's just like basically a lip match, isn't it? Yeah, I think that it can be really tempting to get involved, but I think it's really difficult to mediate completely objectively, and you risk alienating people, because suddenly you'll be the target rather than each other, which I guess may help the horse in that situation, but may not be great for yard politics.
Maybe if they take it out on you, then they'll get back together eventually.
But yeah, I think signposting people to different, you know, to what is out there, and to advice from other objective people can really, really help in that situation. But yeah, it's a horrible, absolutely horrible situation to be in if you've got two people with equal buy-in, and that happens so often in companion animal medicine as well. We see sort of one member of the household will be saying yes and one will be saying no, and
yeah, so definitely does highlight that sort of prior thought and some planning, at least, to kind of get everyone on the similar level, if not the same level, at least.
yeah, I think, yeah, so sort of what Chantil was saying, so I obviously shared Oscar for a long time now, but you know, at the end of the day, it's his owner that makes the decisions, and that is very, very hard. But sometimes you have to respect that, and I think having that kind of clear framework at the beginning, where you know ultimately who is going to make the calls about that horse, is really important.
Yeah.
So that you don't get that situation going forward.
Okay. I had another question, if that's okay. Just going back to this idea about echo chambers, which does relate to both kind of topics. And do you have, I mean, this affects all of us, you know, no matter how much we think we know, you know, obviously we're not necessarily always right. And, you know, yet we still surround ourselves with people, whether it's about politics or whether it's about horses or whatever, you know, we all surround ourselves with those people who think the same as us. Do you have any advice for how we can get better at having rounded views on horses? Like, who should we be listening to? Do you want to go first, Chantal?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the key things is to be aware of it. Certainly, whereas I was aware of sort of the social media aspect of it, I wasn't aware of the search engine factor into it.
That was such a good point when you said that. I hadn't even thought.
Yeah, so that was a surprise to me, and it was only because I was, you know, looking at this research. So I think partly said if you're aware of it, there's different search engines that don't use it. So, you know, I think it's a case of maybe using different search engines if you want to look on the internet. But I think it's a case of just trying to get as many views as possible. I know some people who have, so on Twitter, they've started following people with very different views of their own to try and get that different perspective. And we always say that you should, you know, listen to other people's opinions and respect them. So I think it's a case of we do need to try and do that a little bit more. But ultimately, I mean, I think there's quite a few charities there, and I mean, Joe's mentioned quite a few of them today with the euthanasia guidance, and I think the guidance is there, and they're a good place to start to try and get perhaps a bit more of a rounded view of things, and then sort of explore from there, really.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Joe?
Not really. No, I was very much going to say the same, and I think, yeah, it can be really tempting just to skip over posts and information, papers, articles that you think aren't going to go along with your views on certain things. But I think you can actually learn quite a lot from reading them, even if it, you know, you've got that evidence behind you. So yeah, it's just.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think in relation to euthanasia, it's interesting because obviously some people have quite strong views of, you know, particularly with horses. Obviously, we've got the choice of an injection versus a gun, for example, and some people have very strong views about both of those. Yeah, I always think it's because it's so hard to talk about euthanasia, and it's, you know, it's so sad, and you don't want to upset people by bringing it up and that kind of thing. But in terms of, I always feel like it would be really powerful to hear more people's experiences to kind of learn from them, even if it's not what I would want to go through, or like not or not the thing I would choose for my horse. It would be helpful to hear sort of more people's views, if you see what I mean, to be able to learn from them.
I think it definitely needs to be something that it's okay to talk about more. It is a subject we shy away from, and yeah, there's a lot to learn from. And again, it's like listening to those different viewpoints and why people made the choices they did. I mean, down our yard, we've had a combination. Some horses have been injected, and we've had some that have been shot. And I've never asked the owners why they made those choices. I'm interested in why they made those choices, but I don't know, and I've never been comfortable to ask. But perhaps, you know, it is really something we should be thinking about asking people.
Absolutely.
And when you actually do, you know, you actually do approach people and start having those conversations, most people actually want to talk about it in some way. They want to live their memory of the horse they've lost or the animal they've lost, and share why they made the choices they did, because sometimes it helps people to talk through again, to remind themselves of how it played out that way. So yeah, don't be put off of having that kind of conversation. And I think, you know, hearing people's choices in that way can actually be really informative, and so many different perspectives that you'd never actually have thought of yourself. Actually, I can see why you did that.
Absolutely. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, that was everything I had to ask. Dee, did you have any more questions? I can't see any others on the chat.
No, I think it was more like a reflection of, and I talk about this a lot sort of with my laminitis and weight management research, but and it reflects then also into quality of life, as that monitoring. And you know, we always talk about how we see our horses every day and we might not notice these gradual changes, but like the suggestions of keeping a diary, like I keep an exercise diary for my horses because it helps me then keep track of how much they're doing, you know, doing the weight tracker, but also transferring that into quality of life and keeping a sort of a quality of life diary. And some people commented in the comments that that's a really good idea, and that's something that they would think about doing for their dogs and their horses. So just to help you kind of capture those small changes, that it might be just such a gradual decline that, as Joe said, it almost then becomes a new normal for you, that you might kind of miss these very subtle small changes. So yeah, not really a question, sorry, more just a reflection of, I'm a big fan of kind of monitoring things and helping us then make more objective choices when we can.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it feels like, I mean, I know me as a horse owner, I always want to like do the best I can for my horses, and usually that's like, oh, what, you know, should I like get the physio out every month for them, and like, I don't know, are there like special supplements? I know there aren't, no better than that, but anyway, are there like special supplements I can get or whatever? But like, it's amazing, isn't it? Because it seems like what comes up over and over and over again is that the best thing we can do for our horses is to monitor them really well, so that we can see change happening before it gets bad, because that's what repeatedly, whether it's laminitis or end of life care or anything else, those are the things, or, you know, stress, behaviour, you know, those are the things that help us to really see where the issues are. So I'll go and buy a diary instead of buying a supplement.
Yeah. And I think just that, I know sometimes we're so busy and we'll rush around, and, you know, we'll rush down to the yard and do the jobs and go again, but just taking that time to kind of sit and watch our horses and observe them and, you know, see what they're doing, and then that'll also obviously help with those ongoing monitoring and observations.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Joe and Chantil. It's been really good. I think very, very important topic. Yeah, we need to talk about it more, definitely. So this is just at least a little start. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. And we hope that this has been helpful to you, and that it at least will start to get you thinking about making some plans in the future. And I think a lot of the time it's the same, I think, with people as well. So sorry, I'm just going off on a tangent, but like kind of, you know, making a plan for, if something happens to you, who's going to look after your animals and your, you know, your horses and your dogs, and just kind of thinking about those plans. We know we don't want to think about them, but if it does come to the worst, do we have some sort of, and do we know where to go for that information? That's
so true. I hadn't even thought about that. If I died and my boyfriend had to look after my horse, I mean, he's always just saying I should just set him free.
Well, you're in Wales, so it might, it might work.
It's the Arab. But yeah, that's cool. A good point.
All right, well, hope everyone has a good evening, and this has been recorded, so we will upload it onto YouTube if anyone does want to watch it again, or signpost some friends to it as well, if they might find it useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chantil and Joe. That was absolutely brilliant, very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Cool, so good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.